Today we're talking about my new favorite YouTube camera, the Olympus EM1 Mkii. It's a camera that I've been shooting on for the last couple of weeks due to a new firmware update that just came out, essentially turning this camera into a brand new camera. I reviewed the bigger brother of this camera, the EM1X, with my friend Sarah Dici, and we also did a comparison with my other friend Jevin Dovey. In both of those videos, I talk about the camera, and honestly, the views on both of those videos were abysmal. I don't know why. Maybe it's because nobody cares about Olympus, but I'm gonna change that. Olympus cameras have gotten really good. Let me tell you about it. The EM1 Mkii came out several years ago, and when it did, it was actually right before the GH5 was announced from Panasonic. But then Olympus announced the EM1X this year, and that camera had amazing autofocus, but at a crazy price point. For $3,000, you could get that camera. It was super big, and for me as a video shooter, I felt like I was barely using what that camera was capable of because it was really more geared for photographers. But then, about 2 weeks ago, Olympus did something that nobody saw coming. Let's talk about it at the beach, because this park is kind of lame. Actually switched to the Olympus EM1 II. I'm sitting here on this bench in front of beautiful Laguna Beach, and I want to talk you through this new firmware update and why I think it's so important for this camera, the Olympus EM1 Mkii. And by the way, from here on out, any footage that you see in this video is going to be shot on the EM1 Mkii, unless of course you see B-roll of the camera, which I will shoot on my trusty Z6. So when it comes to making the perfect YouTube camera, there's a lot of things that come into play, and I'm not the only one that feels this way. A lot of YouTubers really rely on having decent autofocus for video, and that's where I want to start off first with the Olympus EM1 II. As you can see, it's locked onto my face as I'm walking, and no matter where I put my face, it is completely tracking it just fine. I'm wide open at f2.8. and even a faster lens like my 15-1.7 locks onto my face perfectly, and I never have to think about it. The autofocus just works. Reminds me a lot of a Canon dual pixel autofocus system. So here's some more tests that I'll do with the new firmware and the autofocus right now. See? Face tracking. Works amazing. Hello. The second thing that I really love about this camera is the fact that it has a flip screen. This camera actually has a real, true flip screen, the one that, you know, everybody wants. The only problem I have with it is the fact that the mic placement is kind of in the wrong place. Here, I'll take a picture so you can see what I'm talking about. So it's kind of like right at the wrong angle. It needs to be up a little higher, that way that you get full articulation on the screen. But one thing that I love about this camera is the screen doesn't dim when you're recording 4K video. One of the big problems I had with the GH5's flip screen is after a couple of minutes, the screen actually completely goes dim. The second thing that I really want on my YouTube camera is reliable stabilization that looks good, that looks pleasing. Now this camera has two different IBIS modes. They call them Mode 1 and Mode 2. Mode 1 is the one that I personally use and the one that I prefer the most. It uses the stabilization of the sensor, but also does some software magic and corrects the wobble effect. Mode 2 is just the sensor stabilization with no electronic stabilization applied. I'm gonna shoot this little walk here in Mode 1, and I'll switch it to Mode 2 right now. So as you can see, the image is a little bit wider than it was earlier. That's because in Mode 2, it's not doing that crop. I'm shooting at 12 millimeters. but as I'm walking, you may see a little bit more wobble, especially in those corners. And to me, I find that extremely distracting. There's a lot of YouTubers who use the GH5 with wide angle lenses, and I see that wobble and it totally throws me off. I can't stand it. I don't want it. All right, I just switched back to mode 1 with the stabilization, and let's look at some examples of the IBIS and how juicy good it actually is. Another thing that I look for with a YouTuber camera is how does this camera look straight out of camera? Because I'm pumping out so many videos every single week and I'm essentially shooting and editing almost every single day, I really want a camera that looks good straight out of the box. I'm shooting on the flat picture profile right now today on this camera right now as you're looking at it because, well, it's a little contrasty and I want to make sure that I'm getting enough dynamic range in the image, but I choose not to shoot in log on this camera because I find that the color just kind of looks a little bit more mushy than the standard profile, or in this case, the flat profile. I actually really love just the basic standard picture profile with the contrast down 1 notch and I think the saturation down a little bit as well. And I take the sharpness completely off because this camera does look a little overly sharpened in a lot of cases. But I really find the image to look really pleasing on this camera body, and that's one of the big reasons why I love the Olympus, because the color is just fabulous. So yeah, this is natural. I find the color to look really pleasing. No color correction right here on this image. This is straight out of the box. And this is what I shoot on when I'm in my studio, when my light is controlled and everything is nice and soft and flat, and I don't have crazy dynamic range going on in the image like this. But for today, I've actually been shooting in the flat picture profile, which I'll show you right now. So this is the flat picture profile. The flat picture profile was created when this camera came out and it's been around for a while. But the new addition with the V3 firmware is the Olympus log. It looks decent, it looks fine. I guess if you're doing higher end production stuff, it's nice to have this log, but I just don't find the color science in log to look all that pleasing. I think either the natural picture profile or the flat profile are the ones that I'm going to use. Now when it comes to slow motion on the EM1 Mark II, unfortunately because this is an older camera, we don't have any 120 frames per second modes on the EM1 Mark II. We only have 1080p at 60 frames per second. As you can see through the B-roll, it does look sharp and clean, but there is no 120. If you want 120 on an Olympus, you're gonna have to shell out $3,000 to buy the new EM1X, which has the same sensor but newer processing to do 120 frames per second. Now, of course, the smaller size and the cheaper price point makes this a better option in my opinion, but if you have to have 120p, then you're gonna have to shell out the cash for that EM1X. Now there's also a couple other things that I want to list off real quick that make this camera super good for YouTube creators. First off, the battery life on this thing is amazing. I did bring an extra battery just in case, but I'm looking at the screen right now and I still have 74 minutes left on this charge. I've been shooting all day for the last 3 hours or so. I really don't think you're gonna need more than 2, maybe 3 if you wanna play it safe, if you're shooting all day. There's another little tidbit that I wanna mention about this camera, and that is the codec size of the 4K. Now, this camera doesn't have 10-bit like the GH5, but it does have a really high bit rate for the 4K mode. It is 8-bit, but it's 237 megabytes per second, which compare that to Sony at 100 megabytes per second in 4K. This one here, which by the way, the last shot was shot in 1080, this one is shot in 4K. Can you tell a difference? I don't know. I'll zoom in a little bit on my beard and you can see a little bit more detail on my beard, I think. Hello, hi beard. So based on what I've told you so far, you might be thinking to yourself, well Dave, this camera has 4K, a flip out selfie screen, amazing IBIS. reliable autofocus, great color science. What's wrong with this camera? There has to be something wrong with it. And there are some cons with this camera. First off, it's an older camera, so it's not able to do 120 frames per second in slow motion. That's not something that everybody needs, and I think for a lot of YouTubers, they tend to overdo it with this, but it is a handy tool, especially for me when I'm doing B-roll. I've been using my Z6 today as my 120 camera and as my stills camera, and I think that's the way to go, is get a camera like maybe a GH5, for example, secondhand. You can get those really cheap used. You can get 120 frames per second if you want it. I think honestly the best thing about this camera is the fact that you can get them used on eBay for a really great price. They were originally designed for photographers, not filmmakers. And because of this firmware, this camera is a much better tool for filmmakers and YouTubers because of that autofocus, because you get the log and a lot of other advancements.
4 to 6 weeks later.
I just think all around this camera has everything that I personally need. And as someone who doesn't even shoot that much 120 to begin with, I'm fine with 60 frames per second. It looks plenty smooth. It's obviously not super duper crazy smooth, but hopefully an EM1 Mark III will come with that. If you're interested in picking up the EM1 Mark II, then please click the link in the description below. I get a small commission from that link, and that's really how I pay my bills. So thank you so much for clicking that link and buying the camera through that link. Again, you can get one of these now for about $1,500 brand new, or even used on eBay or B&H or Adorama, wherever you want, for around $1,100, $1,200. I think it's a heck of a deal, and using this camera every single day for the last couple of weeks has been a joy for me. Yeah, so all around favorite camera. Thanks for watching. Once again, I'm Dave Mays. See you next time.